Okay, so this is Christa Whitney. Today is December 5th, 2013. I'm here with Peter Sokolow in Brooklyn, New York, and we're going to record an interview as part of the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project. Do I have your permission to record?
Yes.
Thank you. So, we can switch between English and Yiddish, do it all in English. What, do you have an opinion about that?
Was er will.
Was er will. Okay. Von wann stammt der Mishpache?
Der Mishpache stammt von Russland. Mein Baba von meiner Tates Zeit, geboren in Sibirien. Cheremcheve, das ist 80 Meilen Ost von Irkutsk, das ist neben Lake Baikal. Aber der Mishpache stammt von Ukraine, wo, you know.
Klein Stadtlach oder Stadt?
Cheremcheve, damals, das war ein Kleinstädtele. Später ist es gewohnt größer.
Und was pflegen Sie tun für Parnasse?
Mein Urgroßvater hat gehabt ein Kretschmer. Das war sein Geschäft. Mein Great-Grandfather, Urgroßvater.
Von der
Ja, es klingt ein bisschen wie Deutsch. Deutsch ist zuerst und dann kommt Jiddisch.
Uh-huh. And the mother's side? The maternal side? Do you know the Parnasse?
Yeah. My grandfather on my mother's side came from Galicia. He was the son of a baker. And when he came to this country, he never pursued that at all. He ended up in the rag biz, if you know what that is. The
in
rag,
New York?
Yeah, Lower East Side, whatever. They ended up in the Bronx.
Can you explain the rag business?
Clothing, men's and women's clothing. He ended up mainly in women's and children's clothing. For a while, he owned a garage, but he ended up with a company that did manufacturing of ladies and children's clothing, and he built it up. He had a nice business.
Do you know any stories from der Alter Heim passed down?
From the Alter Heim? Well, you know, I'm a second-generation American. My parents were born in this country, and they talked very, very little about these things. I can tell you a little bit about my great-uncle, who was the only religious man, basically, in my grandmother, my paternal grandmother's family. He was a shoichet, which is a kosher butcher. And also, I don't know whether he was a moil or not. He may have been. He taught all the children of my father's generation their bar mitzvah parshas. And he was married to two of my great-grandmother's sisters. And the first one died, and he married the second one. And the second one gave him 4 daughters several of whom I knew. And I also knew he only had one son from the first wife. And him I kind of knew, but I didn't see him very often when I was a child. But the other ones I got to see all the time because my grandmother was very close with them. As a matter of fact, one of those, they were first cousins, one of those first cousins married my grandmother's brother. So that particular brother became very wealthy. He was one of 4 people who established the Metropolitan News Delivery firm in New York, which started with Yiddish papers and then went on to everything else. And he had lots of dough. He had a big, when I was a child, he had a large mansion on Eastern Parkway between New York and Brooklyn. Start that again. He had a large mansion between Rogers and Nostrand Avenue on Eastern Parkway, which was hot stuff in those days. And My my grandmother's cousin had servants. She had fur coats. She had nice stuff. And they engineered a wedding. It was a kind of a shidduch kind of a thing between my grandmother and a fellow who made seltzer. So my grandfather was a seltzer man. But she was very jealous of her sister-in-law. That marriage lasted about 6 years. My father was the only child. She practically threw him out of the house when he was, my father was about 6. And of course my father never forgave my grandmother for that. She was a real feminist in the days when that sort of thing didn't exist.
What did that mean? What do you mean?
Well, she was a take charge kind of a person, and she was a single mom, as they call them. And, you know, my father grew up just with her. Funny thing is, my grandfather lived in the neighborhood, and my grandmother made him go to see his father. And sometimes he would ride on the wagon with him and carry the boxes of seltzer, you know.
And did you know your grandparents?
My grandmother on my father's side I knew extremely well. She was the only one that I really got to know. Both my grandfathers died before I was born. My grandfather, the seltzer man, died in 1926. I was born 40. My grandfather on my mother's side died in 1935. He wasn't even 50 yet. And my grandmother on my mother's side I didn't see her very often, but she got sick. She died when I was about 8, but my other one lasted until I was in my 20s. And she and I were very close. I used to go over to her house all the time.
What was she like?
She was a tough lady, but funny thing is that, okay, I'll get into some of these. My grandmother, my father was the meal ticket. He went to Boys High, which was like the college of high schools in Brooklyn. You probably went close by it when you were trying to come here. He ended up at Columbia. He didn't want to go to Columbia. He wanted to go to Cornell. And his training was chemical engineering. And he studied piano as a child. He did very well with it. And he couldn't get a job in the chemical engineering business because Abraham Sokolow did not get a job. They didn't want him.
Because of his name.
Of course, because, you know, they didn't want no yiddles there. Just didn't happen. That was a closed, all the engineering things were closed at that time. All they wanted were what we call nish vernunzig. And so my father became the breadwinner there. Although my grandmother's brothers, she had 3 brothers, all of them became quite well-to-do, paid her rent, and I guess they must have paid for some of the provisions that they had in the house or whatever it was. They had a lot of meals at my Uncle Meyer's house and whatever else. But my father couldn't get into chemical engineering, so he ended up teaching piano. And what he did was he taught the kind of 1920s post-ragtime kind of a style. And he had a lot of Jewish pupils, young Jewish pupils. Some of my father's pupils, one of them was Buddy Strauss. The sun will come out tomorrow, that one. Alan J. Lerner, the lyricist, was one of my father's pupils. Bob Keeshan, Captain Kangaroo, was one of my father's pupils. Him I met. He was a nice guy. Leona Helmsley was one of my father's pupils. And while other piano teachers were getting 50 cents an hour, my father got $3 a half hour. And he built a business. And for a while, he had between 75 and 80 students a week. Well, he made a business out of it. It's not what he wanted to do. And that led to problems between me and my father later on, because he didn't want me to be a musician at all.
Mm-hmm. Where did he teach out of the home, or did he have an office?
He went to people's houses. He went around either by train, took his car, whatever it was. And he also played some jobs, which I ended up as an industry for me. He didn't like that part of it. He did it because it was money. And so he did that. Every time he would meet a girl, my grandmother would try to break it up. When he met my mother, it was too late. he was already 40. My mother grew up in the Bronx, a mixed marriage. She grew up in the Bronx, he in Brooklyn. And they knew each other 3 weeks they were married already.
And your mother grew up in the Bronx?
My mother grew up in the Bronx, Crotona Park area. They ended up as her father became more well-to-do, they ended up on the Grand Concourse. And they ended up moving to West End Avenue in Manhattan. My mother, had married previously. Her husband died. And she had a child by the first husband, and that child died too. So in the space of a year or two, she lost her father, her first husband, and her baby. Yeah, it was pretty rough. She met my father, and we were three. My brother, who was younger than me, my sister, who was older than me, I'm the guy in the middle. And they're all still around. I'm in constant touch with my brother. My sister is living in Israel now. And so that became my father's family. When my grandmother became a grandmother, she mellowed a little bit. She loved the idea. And she liked being with us. We lived in the same neighborhood, and she would walk over. My grandmother was walking until she was past 90.
What neighborhood was that?
Crown Heights. Near Ebbets Field. Oliver Sholem.
Can you describe the neighborhood?
Crown Heights was, at that time, a very middle upper class neighborhood. Nice old. We lived in a private house. The first place we lived was a two-family, which was on President Street between Franklin and Bedford. Then, right after World War II, 1945, my father bought the house on Crown between Bedford and Rogers, which was practically around the corner from Ebbets Field. So whenever there was a yell, everybody turned on the radio to see what was going on. And, my upbringing was interesting. As I say, my father and mother, my mother was 29 when she married my father. As I say, she'd been married before. He was 40. So he was a little past, like I married, I was 22. I had my first child, I was 25 years old. My father had his first child, my sister, when he was 41. I was born, he was 44 already. My brother was born, he was 46. Now, my son is 46. He's got grown children. So, it was not a natural thing for him. And for my mother, it certainly wasn't. My mother she had taught school. And
public school, or?
Yeah, she taught elementary, she taught high school. When I was 13, she went back to work. She became a high school librarian. And I'll get to that in a minute. My father had a dream for me that I would become some kind of a technical or engineering thing, because I had an interest but my interest in technical things was mainly historical. I loved old cars, trolleys, old subway trains, ocean liners. I still have books and books and books all about that subject. And before I got interested in music, that was my kind of hobby. But I didn't have the there's a certain thing that one has to have to be an engineer, and I just didn't have it. And I went to a technical high school. I went to Brooklyn Tech, which was a very highly respected school. I didn't do great there for the first couple of years because I was really like a kind of an immature baby, and we had these some of the technical subjects, industrial processes, like taught us how the steel was made and all that kind of stuff, and there were shop courses, which I was really not that good at. Well, it turned out that my real talent was music, and oh boy, my father didn't care for that much at all.
So
he had a harmonica in his drawer. He read someplace that Abraham Lincoln taught himself the harmonica. He couldn't do a thing with it. My father learned piano, notes, 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 technique, 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 and he had it. My father was really good. He played classical music quite well. He played the Gershwin style. I sound somewhat like my father. My father was my first musical example. So he was my first guy. And he had records of black piano players. Fats Waller, my guy. Earl Hines, Teddy Wilson, all guys like that. And the records he had, Teddy Wilson, were Benny Goodman small bands. I heard Benny Goodman, I went crazy. So I ended up taking up the clarinet. And
so before we get to music, can I ask, what was Jewish about your home growing up?
Not much. My mother was a red communist. She didn't have a card, but she was what I call an armchair communist. In other words, she waved the red flag. All her friends were Stalinists. But when the checks came in from the dividends, from the stocks, she put them in the bank. So that's an armchair communist.
So did she go to meetings? Did you meet her friends?
You know what I'll have to explain to you how this happened. She belonged to the American Labor Party. American Labor Party was not a communist party, but there were a lot of proto-communists involved in that bunch. And toward the end of the American Labor Party's checkered career, it became more and more left. And my mother and all her pals were very, very left-wing types. And okay, they this and that and the other thing, and the Jewish business was soft-pedaled. My grandfather, my mother's father, used to go to ball games on Yom Kippur. So he didn't want to know from it at all. My mother had two brothers, younger brothers. She was the oldest. And they didn't want to know from it either. Now my father, his father had gone to a synagogue which was populated by Lubavitch types. But before Lubavitch came here in large numbers, this goes back to 1908, 1907, 1906, whatever it was. And my father got some Hebrew training at a synagogue in Williamsburg, which they davened Nusach Ari, which is the Lubavitch thing. Not Ashkenaz, not Sfard, but Nusach Ari, which is something that only the Lubavitch do. So my grandfather was obviously, involved. Maybe it was only because he went to that particular synagogue. I don't know. I couldn't ask him because he was gone by the time I came around. And my father had little to say about that. He didn't say how religious he was, how religious he wasn't. My father was a first-generation American in every way. He didn't want to know from it. And my mother certainly didn't want to know from it. But her father, who came from the other side, didn't want to know from it. But my grandfather, on my father's side, did something. So my father learned, because when he was reading Hebrew, and he didn't read Hebrew around us very often, when we were younger, some of the Seders, he would pronounce the O as if it were A, and that's what Lubavitch do. In other words, instead of Shalom, they pronounce Shalem. That's the Lubavitch way of pronouncing it. And that was his training, came from that. And he also studied his bar mitzvah with the uncle I was telling you about, my great uncle Shmuel Moshe, who was the only religious one in that part of the family. So their relationship with religion was, there was no Shabbos. There was no kashrus there. They didn't observe anything at all. There was, we had Hanukkah candles. Grandma would come over and give us Hanukkah gelt.
Pesach?
Pesach we had, but something, it wasn't a real Pesach, because as we got on over that, my mother used to bring chametz into the house on Pesach. So it was the Seder, we didn't have it, but later on it disappeared completely. And all I can say is that I, as a one generation removed, didn't want to know from it. And as soon as I went, they put me in Hebrew school at the Brooklyn Jewish Center, which was conservative. The kinds of teachers that I had were not religious in orientation at all. They were teaching like Israeli type Hebrew, Mechonit, Baruch Atah, the Sephardi pronunciation and all that. And I was not turned on by these particular teachers. So by the time I was bar mitzvah, I never went back to Hebrew school again. That was all. But I was a decent student. I could have done fairly well with it, but it just wasn't there.
What about Yiddish? Did you hear it growing up?
Yiddish, I heard some Yiddish from my grandmother. My grandmother came from a family which spoke mostly Russian. If they spoke among themselves, they spoke Russian. They didn't speak Yiddish. Because after all, they lived in Sharemchebe. They weren't that, there were some Jews there, but not very many. Those who came from the European part of Russia, Ukraine, or whatever it was, of course spoke Yiddish. And when they got to Brooklyn, to Williamsburg, if they had other Jews to speak with, they had to speak Yiddish, because many of those did not really like the idea of speaking Russian or even Polish or things like that. But the only Polish one in my family was my maternal grandfather, who, as I say, was a Galiciana. Mm-hmm. And my grandmother knew quite a bit of Yiddish, of course. My father knew quite a bit of Yiddish, but they never spoke it at home. My mother, when she sollen die Kinder nicht verstehen, so haben gegangen zu reden auf dem Telefon, and her accent was, ich hab gegangen zu, it was like a real Yankee accent. But because of that, I was able to pick up some. Now, my father had studied German in high school. And as I say, I kind of idolized my father. And when I went to high school, I studied German too. When I got to the Catskills as a musician, I realized I could understand almost everything those people were saying. Because frankly, Yiddish is at least 85% German, if not more. All right, some of the words like milchama and mitzia, levona, and things like that, though those words are Hebrew in orientation. And also a lot of it was, if you grew up in Poland, you had Polish words in there. If you grew up in Russia, you had Russian words in there. And I picked up Yiddish working as a musician, as a teenage musician in the Catskills. I began to pick up my Yiddish. My Yiddish is okay. It's not great, but it's okay.
Yeah. So back to, your father learning music from your father. So you heard him playing music?
I heard him playing. I used to sit under that piano that's sitting over there at 3 or 4 years old and listen to him play those Gershwin things. If you want, I can give you an example.
Well, let's do it after. I'll write some notes about what we want you to play after.
All right, fine.
So then you mentioned the records that you were listening to.
I listened to those records from the time that I was about 8 years old. And I gravitated very much toward them because I liked the feeling of the music. It was swing music from the 30s. Mm-hmm. And that was the first music that I really gave a listen to. My mother used to listen to classical radio. And my father played some classical music. From what my mother told me, it was mainly at her instigation that she said, well, you don't have to play only that Gershwin stuff. Why don't you play some classical too? And he did. He got Bach, Scarlatti. He played some Beethoven, some Chopin. But the Bach was really his thing. Mm. My father played Bach very well.
Did you have any Jewish music growing up?
Hardly.
Mm-hmm. So, can you tell me more about this sort of tension with your father around, you becoming a musician and sort of at the early years?
I was, let's say, 10 years old. I had taken some piano lessons from my father. I got as far as we sailed the ocean blue, and we saw that's as far as I got. My father was a very pedantic and slow kind of a teacher. He taught me all I learned from my father, I learned by his example, not by his he was a very, very pedantic type.
Was he using a specific technique,
Well, they were kiddie instruction books, Mm-hmm. And Funny thing is, he was my first Hebrew teacher, and he taught the same way. Be, ba, ba, that kind of thing. Funny thing is, I learned more from him than I learned from my first Hebrew teacher. He also was, when I was having trouble with math in the beginning of high school, he was my math teacher. So that he could do. He was very good at that. And when I picked up that harmonica, I found out I can play tunes on that thing. In 5 minutes, I was playing all kinds of songs. And I think my father must have heard me, and he got a little frightened. I didn't know whether, Now, when it took me a long time to do it, but I've been listening to those Goodman records. For a while, I put them away. Well, when I picked them up again, I was about 11. And oh boy, I wore some of them out. And then I started going out and buying my own records shortly after that. When I had my allowances or whatever it was, I bought my own records. I have a library downstairs you wouldn't believe. And
what kind of stuff were you buying then?
mainly the swing stuff.
Swing stuff, yeah.
Yeah. Ellington, Goodman. I started reading the books. And from the books, I got, okay, I want to hear this one, I want to hear that one. And some of the older stuff, King Oliver, Armstrong, Bix Beiderbecke became a big favorite of mine. James P. Johnson, who was Fats Waller's teacher. I learned how to play almost exactly like him. And taught myself how to play like Fats Waller, of course. I sing like him, I play like him. And when I was about 13, my father finally broke down and got me a clarinet. And he found a teacher, a local guy in the area, a guy who actually was a club date guy. He wasn't a real teacher. But I don't know how well I would have responded to that kind of teaching because, frankly, I was a lazy kid. But I had the clarinet, maybe 3 weeks. I was playing a full scale in a low register. I started playing songs. And the more I learned the clarinet, the more I could play. Finally, I began to meet a couple of young people who played some music. And they said, you want to make some money? Get a saxophone. Oh, boy, started going after. My father didn't want to buy me a saxophone. Oh, please. But the instruments he bought me were cheap stuff. And the problem is I learned some bad habits on them. I had to go out later on and buy my own with my own money. Well, for that matter, my father also. My father had a thing about spending money. He didn't like it. And my bar mitzvah present was a bicycle, but I paid for half of it myself because he didn't want to buy that one. He wanted to buy the cheaper one. I didn't want the cheaper one. I wanted a more expensive one. So I took some of the money that I got in checks and I bought the bicycle that I wanted, not the one that he wanted. Well, he bought me a cheap saxophone and he bought me a cheap clarinet. Finally, I ended up getting rid of them. But still, I learned partly by playing along with the records as they were playing on the phonograph.
And so your father, you said, was your main teacher, at least for piano. And
yes, he was. But I learned more from him by, as I say, by his example than by what he taught me, like in words or do this, do that, the other thing.
So, what was your first gig?
My first gig was in December of 1956. It was a little kiddie. The kids used to have these little dances or kind of stuff like that because I got to know some. I had been going around to other teenage musicians' houses and we used to rehearse, we used to jam, we used to do that kind of thing. So I learned a bunch of songs. I learned songs very quickly. If you asked me to play my entire repertoire, at this point I must know 10,000 songs or more, all by memory. And I can play them in keys because I had to play for singers and things like that, But the point here was that this was my calling, and I just jumped on it. So first I learned them on the sax and the clarinet, and then I sat down at the piano and I learned the harmonies too. And I taught myself basically how to play a kind of a jazz style on the piano as well. So I had everything going for me there. So my first job was one of these things. I got $5. I was on the sax, and there was a piano and a drummer, and who was the fourth piece? I believe it might have been a guitar. And we played dance music for the kids. Now, the funny thing is that rock and roll began to come around at that point. My sister was rock and roll crazy. She had all these. I learned a whole bunch of rock and roll off my sister's records. She had Chuck Berry. She had Fats Domino. She had a lot of the black ones. Little Richard. She had Jerry Lee Lewis. Elvis, when Elvis came out, Sugarville. She went totally bonkers. And so I learned a lot of these, like Elvis, Little Teddy Bear, and of course the Hound Dog and all that stuff. So I could play rock and roll even though I hated it. Because to me, I was now listening to swing, Dixieland, and more modern jazz, which had much more sophistication and harmony and improvisation, where the other stuff was just ding, 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 ding. It was nothing. So to me, it was, how can you listen to that garbage? Well, my sister got angry at me. She would yell, tell me to go to hell.
So can you just describe how you did this? How did you learn a tune from a record?
The record would play, and it would go into the tape recorder that was in there. And, after about two, 3, 4 times, I had it. I knew it. I could also hear the harmonies, even though I didn't know what they were called. I also have a disease known as absolute pitch. In other words, I can sing a note or tell you what note it is without the use of an instrument. So I was a quick learner. That was my real thing, was learning that kind of stuff. So by the time I took up the clarinet originally, I was not quite 14 years old. I was about 13. The piano I already played some. The harmonica I played quite well at that point. And I began to just pick up on these things. Unfortunately, because I was such a quick learn, I let my reading go. So I was never as good a music reader at that point in my life as I had to be to make a living at music. I learned it. It was just something I was forced to do, and I didn't love it either. Because my ear was so good that I was picking up all this stuff. I learned it all quickly. Yeah. And also, for a lazy guy like me, it was just perfect. I could just, I could do that. Nothing.
So did you start out, which came first, the club dates or the Catskills?
The club dates came first. Not by much.
Can you describe that scene?
Club dates. The word club date is a euphemism for a country club type of a job. But as I say, it was a euphemism. What it really meant was weddings and bar mitzvahs. Sometimes Landsmannschaft. I did a couple of Landsmannschaft when I was young. Banquets, that kind of thing. And there were bands that were playing at these things. I did my first bar mitzvah. I was nearly graduating from high school. I got a job playing, synagogue in Williamsburg with a band which I put together of some of my friends. And it was the brother of one of the guys in my high school class. So we played the job. We didn't do a great job, but we got $50 for four musicians. So, all right. And I began to get calls from other musicians, and they would say, listen, I got this. You want to come and do it? Sure, absolutely. Take my horn. I didn't drive or anything like that. I used to take the thing. I used to go on the bus.
So these were Jewish gigs? And what?
Mostly.
So what kind of
I
music
played
were you
some
playing?
non-Jewish ones too. What did we play? We played whatever American songs were popular at the time. Some of the tunes even from My Fair Lady or shows a little bit earlier than that. There were popular songs like guys like Tony Bennett or Sinatra was singing. Songs like Over the Rainbow. Well, Tony Bennett was singing Because of You, There's a Song in My Heart. Okay, fine. That was one of them. And other ones like that were There Goes My Heart, There Goes the One I Love. Ba, 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 ba. Those were the ones that were popular at the time. And as I said, could have danced all night, The Street Where You Live, things like that. Those were the popular show tunes of the time. And we played waltzes. Now, where did I pick up the Jewish? When you got involved in this, and if you were going to go to the Catskill Mountains, you had to learn some Jewish songs. There was a book called the Kamen, K-A-M-M-E-N, which was a folio of partly Jewish, partly Hungarian, partly Polish, things like that. And you would buy this book. There was a book for tenor saxophone. There was a book for trumpet. There was a book for piano and accordion. And I had this book like all the other guys did. We all had Kamen books. So the first one Kamen book, yeah, da 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 da, yeah, da 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 dee da. That's an old Freilachs. Or yeah, ba 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 dee da 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 da. So we learned these. We played them from the Kamen book. Now later on, I found out. Some of my older friends that I had made by that point told me, we saw a guy come on a job at a Kamen book, we knew he was an amateur. But we were amateurs, we were kids, we were just learning. So I went to the Catskill Mountains. First place I played was an Orthodox hotel. I didn't know from nothing. Boy, was that a scare.
Yeah, tell me about that. What was your
The
first
place was called
impression?
Shlomi Ehrenreich's Hotel. And it was like exactly what it sounded like, a dump. And it was the equivalent at that time of glatt kosher. I did not know very many, if any, religious people at the time, but there were religious people, many of whom had come over as Holocaust survivors. And they were coming to this hotel. And some of them were Hungarian, they wanted to hear Hungarian Chardash, which there was some in the Kamen book, we really didn't know it. And the kind of music that they thought of for dancing at weddings, chasanas, at parties, had to do with like the parshas that you would read for Od Yeshama B'Yara Yehuda, that they were playing for the bride and the groom. Yosis alai, that kind of thing. The only Chos and Kala song we knew was Chos and Kala Mazel Tov. And that was more for the non-religious people than for the religious. I was out of that place in 3 weeks. I hated it. I was treated like a goy, I was, compared with them, I was. I got a job after that in a bungalow colony, one of the few that had a band. And they were friends of mine who I graduated with high school from. So we were all Brooklyn Tech guys, class of 1957. We had 2 saxes, me and another guy, a piano player who played like my father, oddly enough. He played the old style. And a drummer who later on became the composer of a song called My Boyfriend's Back and It'll Save Your Reputation, Hey La, Hey La. And then this guy was a rock and roll kind of a guy. So we got involved. We learned some rock and roll. We learned some of the jazz too, like The Lady is a Tramp and songs like that, which were older show tunes, which the jazz guys used to play. We used to play some of those. We learned how to play cha-chas, rumbas. Did we learn the Yiddish show tunes? I learned the Yiddish show tunes the next year. I was 18 years old, and I had graduated high school already. The fellow who took my place in what we called a dance band at Brooklyn Tech, I ended up, finally in the senior year, I made the dance band. I was one of the saxophone players. The guy who took my chair lived in an apartment house with an old band leader, a guy, at that time in his 40s, was an old man. I was 18. And I went to this guy's house, again, by bus. And I brought my stuff there, and I got the job because I knew a lot of songs. And when I went that summer, it was a place in Mountaindale called the New Prospect Hotel. And that was the real classic, old-fashioned Catskill Mountains place.
Can you just set the scene for people who don't know about the Catskills?
The Catskill Mountains were not really the Catskill Mountains at all. The Catskill Mountains, the real high Catskill Mountains, were up going toward Albany, Kingston, that area. This was the foothills of the Catskills, further south from Ellenville in Ulster County, going up to Monticello, going up to Liberty, Parksville, Woodridge, Mountaindale. There were all these pretty crummy little towns. And these places came alive during the summer because they were bungalow colonies, azach. They were a ton of bungalow colonies. And there were lots and lots of hotels. There must have been about 500 hotels. There were little dumps like the place I played. Then there were the big fancy ones like the Concord, and Grossinger's, and the Windsor, and Nemerson, and Stevensville Hotel, and places like that. I was working with two older musicians. And one of them was a trumpet player who kind of doubled on bass. The only thing is, what he played on the bass couldn't be called bass playing in any way. He just played whatever note came out of it. It just go thump, 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 thump. But he played the trumpet. He had teeth that were out of line. And his high note in the trumpet was the middle of the horn's range. And he was a really corny, and the accordion, the guy played mostly accordion. He played piano and accordion. He played all the songs, but he played them with wrong chords. And the first night out, I told him, you know something, Harry, you're playing wrong chords. He said to me, you young punk, you mean I'm 30 years in the business, you tell me I'm playing wrong? I said, suit yourself. The next day, Harry takes me to meet my first Epstein brother, Isidore, or Chiswick Epstein. Played the saxophone in the real old-fashioned style with a big vibrato. Sounded like a truck starting up. And these guys played Jewish. They were really, they were my introduction to Klezmer. But in those days, if you called a guy a Klezmer, it was an insult. You want to punch him in the mouth. He says, he's nothing but a Klezmer. Klezmer means guy only plays these little Jewish songs, and he can't play The Lady is a Tramp. He can't play Body and Soul or whatever songs were the hip songs to play. These guys didn't know. But what they did for me was more than I can imagine. First of all, Ralph, the trumpet player and bass player, he sang pretty badly, but he sang all the Yiddish theater songs. Shtetl Belts, Shemet Lavuna, by me Mr. Shane in Yiddish, of course, and A Bissel Zun, A Bissel Regen. So I got to learn all these songs very quickly. These were not in the Kamen book. These you had to learn, you know. There were other folios around, so I picked up a couple of those. But also I was able to pick up the Yiddish words, because that was my training ground in Yiddish. So I was not only learning the repertoire, I was learning the Yiddish language. And some of the things that people talked about in the Yiddish culture, I learned about not at home, because my parents didn't want to know from it. I learned from the people in the Catskills who were the guests at those hotels.
Yeah, who were the guests?
They were older people, basically, who were coming up to the country for a little, they came up for a couple of weeks, so they would play shuffleboard, they would play whatever it was, and then they would play some dance music for them, play waltzes and foxtrots and rumbas and whatever. The cha-cha became popular, we played the merengue for them, whatever it was. And to them, this was a real vacation. But some of the hotels that I played at, because a lot of chicks in those hotels. 7 chicks, 8 chicks, and 9 chicks. Which meant this was the average age of the guests at the hotel. So they wanted us to play Vuzan and ma 7 Gitter. So we learned a bunch of those things. Der zähl mir Alter, der zähl mir geschwind, weil ich will wissen alles hat sind. And this was important. I learned Romania. I learned up in the Catskills from these things. I do it. Mm-hmm. Well, I do all these things. And then I learned some of the Israeli music, the Havana Gila.
That was up in the Catskills too?
I learned, we would play whatever Hora music we played were Israeli. Because the old Klezmer Bulgars were gone. Nobody wanted to hear them. They wanted to hear Venu Shalom Alechem, they wanted to hear Havana Gila and, what do you call it? Atza Alinu, Atza Alinu. These were the ones that we basically played. And that kind of song. Mm-hmm. And the Bulgars, the first time I ever heard a Bulgar must have been off a Dave Terrace record. I got some Dave Terrace. A friend of mine made a tape, and I copied that tape. And I learned a bunch of things off that. So all of a sudden, I had a small inkling of what the klezmer thing was. Then when I played with Dave, I was 19. I got to play with Dave because these Ralph and Harry hired him to do a job. Most of the things that he played were not his real European Freilich and Bulgar material. Most of it was the Yiddish theater stuff. But of course, Dave was Dave.
Can you describe what he was like?
Yes, he's a very proud man. I was a kid, 19 years old. He takes a look at me and says, I am teacher of clarinet. All the best players come to me. In other words, get down on the floor and lick my boots. And I would be playing like kind of harmony parts. I kind of laid back because I was afraid of this guy. But he would play, and, you know, these pearls would come out. Well, the first Epstein brother that I met was one of the ones who led me into this. And when I went to him, when Berman took me, when Harry took me to the place where he was working in the Catskills, he looked at me. He was a short guy with a big fat belly, and I was like a head taller than him. He looked up at me and says, how do you do? How do you like his chords? As I said, as if to say, nish tugadach, don't even think about it. We got a little laugh out of that. As a matter of fact, a bunch of funny stories came out of that. We were doing a job in a hotel. Chai Epstein, myself, a couple of other guys who doubled on violin. And Chai Epstein and I were standing back there. And they were playing All the Things You Are, which is an extremely complex song. It goes into every key on the chromatic scale. And there's Ralph with his bass. He takes his bow, and the song is in the key of A flat. So he picks out an A flat, and he played nothing but an A flat all the way through this. While the song was going into E, into G, into this and that, he's playing an A flat. We were doubled over. He come off the stage, Ralph, and he goes, how'd you like that, fellas? With the bow, huh? With the bow. What can you tell him? You know, this idiot. Well, the problem was that I came up in the bottom of the music business. These guys were really awful. And the musicians I played with were terrible. But it was a good education for me. I had to, first of all, block them out. Because if I try to play a harmony part, a correct harmony part, it would clash with what these schmagegis were playing. So it was really like, you know, but I didn't get my enjoyment out of that. My enjoyment was playing jazz. Mm-hmm. And I used to jam with my friends. That was the real enjoyment. Yeah. But the money that I was making doing this over here, I didn't have to take an allowance from my mother anymore. I was a working man. And plus I was learning all kinds of repertoire. And that's what gave me the Jewish. That mainly came from my Catskills experience. Mm-hmm. And of course, to be able to speak some Yiddish. And I found that I could do it because I knew enough German. I studied 3 years of German in high school, and my first year in college I had a year of German as well. And I spoke German fairly well.
Was it all in Yiddish in the Catskills?
No.
No.
Not at all. Not the places that I was working. The only places that really were Yiddish. There were some places which attracted a clientele where they wanted Yiddish entertainment and all that kind of stuff. Now, I did find one year that in that place in Mountaindale, they had a comedian come in who did everything in Yiddish. His name was Michael Rosenberg, and he was known. He was a master. He comes up over there with a poker face, didn't crack a smile. But he was telling these stories in Yiddish. The people were on the floor. Now, I understood maybe about a third of what it was that he was saying. Today, I would understand much more. But I think we played for Jenny Goldstein. Jenny Goldstein was a Yiddish theater star. I didn't get to meet some of those people like Seymour Rexite and things until I was already much later on. I got to meet Polly Pecan, I got to meet Seymour Rexite, I got to meet some people like that, Fivish Finkel and all of these. But it was a start.
So at that time, you know, I think of the Catskills and sometimes you think of, blacklisted artists. Was politics, were you aware of that when you were
Sure, I
up
was
there?
aware of that. My mother was right in the middle of it. We would save the Rosenbergs. You kidding? I knew about the blacklisted people, but the hotel we played at now, the hotels that we were playing at were so cheap they wouldn't have paid the price. Because the blacklisted guys wanted some kind of a living wage. These places were paying garbage.
Right.
No, they were too low a class.
Yeah. So who were your, you've mentioned some of them, but I'll ask, who were your main mentors
Okay,
in music?
now, my father, of course, was the first one. And he was very important because he was a good musician. The Epstein boys were 4 brothers. Chai, the first one, we used to call Chai. His nickname was Chiswick.
Mm-hmm.
It's really Yitzchak. Chiswick. His English name was Isidore. Then there was Willie, who played the trumpet. He was a good trumpet player, Willie. Very nice trumpet player. And Julie, who played the drums. But the king of that family was the oldest brother, Max. Max Epstein was originally a violinist. He still played well even into his older years. Then he took up the clarinet and sax. And when he took up the clarinet, he became one of the pioneers, one of the highest, most sought-after Jewish-style clarinet players. And boy, Maxie, I'll tell you, we went to Europe in 1992. My wife was with me. She said to Maxie, I've heard a lot of the other players, but now I understand what people are talking about. He really got a kick out of that. The fact that this is the Ezuk the Nemes. You know what I mean? And he was. Now Maxie, I met Maxie a little bit later, but Chai, I had a wonderful time with Chai. I really did. And I learned a heck of a lot from these guys. And they introduced me to some other players, of course, Dave, and some of the accordion and pianists. He had a guy called Walter Cam. He looked like a bulldog, a face like that, but boy, could he play. He sounded like my father. As soon as I heard that, I said, that's for me. He played very, very well. And also there was a guy he became one of the biggest leaders in the field of Hasidic music. His name was Rudy Tepel. Rudy's real name was Harry, but they called him Rudy. Why Rudy? Because in the early years when people were taking up the saxophone, there was a guy who was a kind of a vaudeville star. His name was Rudy Wiedoft. And Rudy Valley got his nickname from there because, hey, everybody who plays the saxophone, they call Rudy. So Rudy Tepel was the only Rudy that I knew that had come from that thing. And he also played with a big sound that sounded like a truck starting up. Of a big, wide vibrato. They wanted me to learn how to play like that. I actually had to. It took some doing. But Rudy played clarinet also. Hey, but he played clarinet with a saxophone sound. So it sounded like with that vibrato. See, the real Klezmer guys played with some vibrato, but not like that. But I learned from Rudy a whole repertoire of Hasidic stuff. And the Hasidic became a big deal because they came over here after World War II. These were the survivors. And they became an industry. A lot of those weddings that the Hasidim had were on weeknights. So you could make a full-time living in music. Not just the weekend jobs, which were the American and that kind of stuff, but by playing the Hasidic, you could also make a nice buck on the weekdays. And I became one of the busiest guys in that line. So I learned that from these people. And the Epstein boys were my major leaders in the Hasidic field in the late 1960s. I also learned, I played with a bunch of younger guys. And when I came home, I remember telling my wife, it's like going back to junior high school because these guys played like kids. I knew some of these songs, but there was 2 different Hasidic repertoires. There was one which the young kids were making up their own songs, and there were one which were the old European things. So now I had to learn that stuff too. So some of the other mentors that I had, well, Max Epstein certainly was the most important. And then I got to meet little Sidney Beckerman. Sidney Beckerman's father was a real klezmer. Before Dave Terrace came to this country, he was one of the top guys. And Sidney, everybody considered kind of a weak. He didn't really play great or anything. I got news. He had a little style of his own, which was very nice. And he taught me, about 50 frelas, 50 old-style Bulgars I learned from Sidney. And I wrote them down. And there was the basis I have a large repertoire book in which I have a bunch of Hasidic things. I have a bunch of these frelas and Bulgars, and I have Yiddish theater stuff. And I have frelas and Bulgars from Naftula, from Dave Terrace, from Maxie, and from a couple of, and from Sidney. And Sidney had these Bulgars that his father used to play. Now, there was another saxophone player, clarinet and saxophone player called Howie Leese, who was really a major talent. He could fake harmony like nobody could. And sitting next to him, I picked up all kinds of ideas on what to do with that. And I got a chance to play with some rather good jazz players and all of these Jewish guys. Rudy Teppel had a trumpet player, a young fellow who was not that much older than me, called Marty Bass, who played just lovely. The right way to play Jewish trumpet, Marty was it. And listening to them, okay, this is the way you phrase this music. And you don't go a lot of notes. Maxie said to me, kid, you play good clarinet. Very good. But you have to understand one thing. The dreidlach, meaning the ornaments, are there to enhance the melody, not the other way around. Well, me, I was a bebop guy. And, bebop guys play a lot of notes. And from that I learned, no, that's not the way to do it. In other words, if you lose the melody, it's a dead issue. Put those little curls and those little extra, what we call the dreidlach, that kind of thing is what these people taught me. And I was lucky that I had the opportunity to do it, because here I was, at that time, a young fellow in my mid to late 20s. These guys were already 60 or whatever. They were teaching me gratis. I didn't have to go to them for lessons. They were right there. I was learning it on the job. Then when I became a keyboard player, it became even better, because I got a chance to play with a lot more of these guys. A lot of the keyboard players we had were not that good. I think I was considered one of the best ones at the time. I became Dave's regular keyboard player. I was his last regular keyboard player. So I was playing jobs with Dave. I was playing with the Epstein boys. I was playing with Rudy. I was playing a lot of Jewish jobs. I was lucky at the same time to be playing with some old Dixieland musicians. And from them, I learned the right way to fill out an ensemble, and what goes and what doesn't go for, like playing a nice bouncy Dixieland swing kind of a style. Because we played Dixieland not like the real old-fashioned stuff, but right in the middle, really on basically a swing style. Mm-hmm. So I went from swing back to Dixieland, forward to bebop, and then I ended up going back to Dixieland again. But I loved it. I had a great time playing with these things. And so when I switched over to keyboard.
When did that happen?
I switched to keyboard full-time in the early 1970s. Mm-hmm. I bought an electric keyboard, and I asked some of my friends I've been playing. I was a sax player. I was playing on the job. I kind of listened to them. I asked them for some hints, what kind of instrument to get, how to do this, how to do that, and the other thing, walk a bass line with the left hand and all that stuff. Well, because I played the Fats Waller stride piano style, I learned easily how to play one-finger bass lines for electric keyboard. Mm-hmm. And then, because I had the stride style going for me, I became a Dixieland guy as well.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe, we're going to keep going on this, but just before we do, can you describe what was a typical Hasidic gig?
Well, it all depends on where. If you played in Williamsburg, that was mainly Satmar Hasidim. So you had, the full beards and the hats. I also played in Crown Heights. I played the Lubavitch weddings. And when I first got started in that, originally, if you played for Bubov, you had to play Bubov songs. If you played for Satmar, you had to play Satmar songs. If you played for Lubavitch, you had to play Lubavitch songs. Later on, it kind of all became, famished. It became like a pot of cholent.
So who did you learn the nigunim from?
I learned the Gudim on the job. On the job. Also, Rudy Teppel had made a couple of recordings. One Lubavitch recording and one regular Hasidic stuff, European, like Mudgets and Satmar and all these things. I copied down all the songs on that record and I learned them. As I was writing, I learned the songs.
So by then, you said earlier on you weren't so good at writing, but by then,
by then I had already picked it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I could write very fast because, as I say, I hear exactly what it is and I just go bang, bang, bang. So also I became an arranger, and to become an arranger you have to be able to do that. So I did.
And did you have to, like for the Catskills gigs, did you have to sight read, whatever they put in front of you?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I wasn't that great at it, but I became better as I went along. But those hotels, the kind of bands we had was so bad that the people who came in, the acts that came in over there knew that they were going to get murdered anyway.
So I kind of have this impression that you have two careers going on, simultaneously. Can you explain that?
Wir soll machen ein Leben. Und zu machen ein Leben soll wir spielen alle Musik. In other words, I had to play Dixieland music. That was more for my own enjoyment. But of course, they were jobs. They were Dixieland jobs. So I made some money on that. When we played the regular American, Jewish American kinds of jobs, it was mostly American music. Then, as time went on, it was more and more rock. And we had to also play the various Latin styles and all those things, and whatever else. And the new show tunes came out. Barbra Streisand material became popular, and this became popular, that became popular, and had to learn some things from Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Whatever was out there, Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, the kinds of group. Beatles songs, when Beatles songs came in, man, everybody had to learn all the Beatles songs. So I did.
And you were up at the Catskills until the very end. You said your last
summer. Yeah, here was my Catskills thing. 1957, 58, 59, 60, I went to Europe with a Dixieland band, college Dixieland band. I went to Europe.
Where'd you go?
Mostly Germany and also Holland. Were we in Belgium then? No, we weren't. Where else? We went to West and East Germany at the time.
What was that like?
Well, Germany at the time was Wiederaufbau. Everything was being reconstructed. And every place you went, there were cranes, they were building up, they were tearing down all the old things. We were in Berlin, the first time I was in Berlin there. We actually took an army tour, and at that time there was no wall yet, so we went around. It looked like the Russians actually left East Germany to look as horrible as, well, because, the Russians were the ones who suffered the most under them. So they paid them back in spades. And I played in a couple of clubs, a club in Frankfurt am Main, and Berlin. We played army things. They hired us mainly to do like army, because the American army was a big presence because the communists were right over the border. So we were protecting our freedom-loving friends in Germany, you know what I mean. Well, I learned the hard way, but...
Can you explain more what you mean?
Well, I was able to speak enough German to get by over there. And alle Menschen sind Brüder, aber ich war in Armee, ich war im Luftwaffe and all of that. They would immediately tell you what part of the armed forces they were in. And you could hear, you knew. You just knew. And also, we didn't say, ich bin ein Jude. Nein, das passt nicht. Can't do that. Oh, no. And I sounded like, when I spoke German, I sounded like I was speaking German, not Yiddish. And it was a strange experience, put it that way. But it was, hey, listen, I was a kid of 20. And I learned,
What did your parents think when you went to Germany or Europe for
I
the
don't
first
know, I
time?
thought they kind of approved of it. You know, it was a nice idea for me to go over there, and it was a great experience. You know, nothing untoward actually happened, but you know, but you can, you know, you feel, you know, you feel a draft. Yeah. Hey, it wasn't that far after the war. It was 15 years after the war was ended, 1960. 1960. Ehe der Mauer. The Mauer was schon nicht gebaut. You know, it wasn't built yet.
Right. Can we go back and tell me what, you grew up basically during the war. What do you remember of that?
Very, very slight. I was 3, 4, 5 years old. There were sometimes the air raid sirens would go off. They would have these drills, you know, and things like that. Once in a while, people would have to, you know, turn off their lights and pull the shades down and all that kind of stuff. And the defense guys would walk around the streets checking it out. I do remember one interesting thing. When my mother listened to news broadcasts, she listened to WEVD and she listened to the Yiddish, so that, you know, she understood more than she would admit to. So they were listening to the Yiddish broadcast, sollen die Kinder nicht verstehen, you know what I mean. And I remember at the very end of the war, when VE Day came around, they had effigies of Hitler and Mussolini hanging. But the war really, you know, I was a kid of 5. You know, it didn't really penetrate. It wasn't that kind of thing. I had no idea of any Holocaust or anything like that. No idea.
When did you find out about that? How?
I found out about that a few years later. You know, I was 10, 11, 12. That's when it began to happen. You began to hear about these things.
And you mentioned before with the people wanting to hear the Israeli tunes.
Yeah.
How did the rise of Israeli culture affect the Jewish music scene in the Catskills, and the Yiddish not being as desirable, maybe?
Well, you see, for dancing, the Hava Nagila became the thing. And, you know, the people who were of that generation were first generation Americans, and my group of the second generation Americans. They weren't, you know, Dave Terrace and Naftula and all that kind of stuff meant nothing to them anymore. And so it's a Jewish song, that's all. So you played, these were the ones we played for that sort of thing.
And you knew Dave Terrace. I mean, how did he react to that?
He learned some of those songs too. Hey, like all the other guys, they had to learn that. So if people want to hear, so you do it. Maxie Epstein made a Klezmer album, and the guy wanted him to put Hava Nagila on it, so Maxie did a Klezmer version of Hava Nagila. And Dave Terrace's son-in-law, Sammy Musiker, who I never met. Oh boy, do I wish I had. I also wish I'd met Naftula. When I was in Shlomi Aaron-Rock's hotel, Naftula was in the same town, like Sheldrake.
This is Brandwein, right?
Yeah. I didn't get a chance to hear him because I had no car. Nobody would have taken me over there. And he was a free, non-paying guest at the Overlook Hotel, which was in the same town. And he would sit there and drink. Naftula was an alcoholic. He would sit there and drink. And once a night or twice a night, he would pick up his clarinet and start to play. And he still could. He still could. He didn't sound like he did when he was young, but he could still play. And I missed that opportunity. I didn't really get a chance to hear Naftula until I heard his recordings. That's too bad. Well, I wasn't old enough. A lot of guys I knew used to play with Naftula. They knew him. Sidney Beckerman did, and Howie Lease did, and some of those guys, all the old trumpet players, Louis Levinsky, and certainly Willie Epstein played with him. And Maxie Epstein, I think, did too.
So you were really of a different generation, obviously, than these people you were playing with. What was it like to be the young guy?
You want to know something? I was an apprentice. And I did consider myself fortunate enough to be playing with these people. I always had a feeling for history. I liked old cars. I could tell the year of all the old cars, 33 Buick 32. I knew the difference in style. I knew the difference in sound from the bands I heard and all that, from the old recordings and things. And imagine being able to play with, like Louis Armstrong, you know. Well, Dave Terrace was Louis Armstrong. He was a pioneer. And I got a chance to play with these guys. You listen to a guy like Maxie, boy, I'm telling you. Yiddish and Tom. And and being that they approved of me, and they liked me, they thought that I was talented. Can't go wrong with that. Can't beat it, I'll tell you something, because I really worked at it. It was something that I was motivated. Even though it was old music, I liked it. I really, you know, every dance music has got its own kind of swing. The Irish, the bluegrass, well, the Jewish had its own kind of swing. I got to play with some of those old drummers. Benny Zucker, Irving Gratz, Willie Coleman. I got to play with some of these real old-time drummers. Man, that was a kick. Well, the old Dixieland drummers used to play like that, too. Dixieland drummers used to play like that. So it's like being in the middle of an old-time record. It's a tremendous feeling. I still play once in a while with bands that we play swing-style stuff from the late 30s. And it sounds like an old band. It's supposed to.
Yeah. Do you have any, favorite stories from gigs?
Well, let's see. I did so many of them.
Anything funny or any disasters?
Well, like I say, Ralph playing the one note, that's one of the funny stories of that thing over there. Gee. The problem is, the older I get, the farther back it becomes, It's kind of tough to... While we were playing in Europe, I went to Europe with the Epstein brothers, and Willie was playing a solo, and all of a sudden he just drops. I thought, oh my God, he must have had a heart attack. His false teeth fell out. False teeth. Playing the trumpet, you have to push against the teeth. That's what happened. The false teeth fell out.
So when did you go with them to Europe?
Originally 1992. That comes after the next part of the story.
Right,
I think we should get to that.
Yeah. Any other funny stories before we get to that?
I was doing a bar mitzvah in Long Island, in Lynbrook. There was a place called the Beth David of Lynbrook. And there was a hotshot guy who was a real, like a kind of a, just this side of illegal business kind of a guy. And he was throwing a bar mitzvah for his kid. And there was a flower place with a vertical sign that had movable letters like a movie theater would have. Azaleas, this price, that thing. He took that thing and he hired it out, and now it said, this way to Alan Brownstein's bar mitzvah. And so we go into the place over there, and he has a monkey handing out yarmulkes. Well, the monkey fell asleep. So I don't know what happened to the yarmulkes, but I did two of those for him, but this one particularly had the monkey, and they would ride into the ballroom on like little motorcycles and things like that, and oh, God, some of these people were so ridiculous. It was really like morons, had no idea what they were supposed to be doing, and this was supposed to be a bar mitzvah. I mean that's not what a bar mitzvah is all about. My sons had real bar mitzvahs, but okay, never mind. But there was the monkey handing out the yarmulkes and it's silly stuff like that. Some of these things were. Oh yes, I did a few Landsmannschaften for a refugee leader. This man was unbelievable. His name was Al Periton, P-E-R-A-T-I-N, Periton. He had a wife who played the piano. Badly. I was one of the saxophone players. for some reason or other, this was a Diplomat Hotel on 43rd Street near 6th Avenue in Manhattan. And there was a Landsmannschaft. And they're singing the Star Spangled Banner, and all of a sudden the bubbles, they had a bubble machine like Lawrence Welk used to have, and the bubbles are coming out in the middle of the Star Spangled Banner and the Hatikva. These bubbles are coming out. He put together a band, this Periton. He had another saxophone player on the job who looked like he just stepped out of a coffin. He was wearing an outfit, at that time, 1960 or so, the lapels were thin, had small bow ties. This guy was wearing a mohair suit with airplane lapels, double-breasted style, spats on the shoe. He looked like something out of 1925. And to get a vibrato out of the horn, he shook it, so it was yeah, like that. His name was Iggy Levinson. I still remember to this day. And what a horror. We had a trumpet player who sounded like, there was a guy who used to play for Paul Whiteman called Henry Buzzy, who played with a sound like a nanny goat. This band starts to play, and it was all I could do from falling on the floor laughing. And the old lady was going bang, 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 bang. And he put the Periton with his drum. He had a bass drum like this, going boom, chaka, boom, chaka, boom, chaka. It sounded like a bunch of Czechoslovakians trying to play jazz at that time. See, later on, Czechoslovakians learned how to play jazz, but this was 1960. The trumpet player walks out. As it turned out, he was also a cantor. So I say to Periton, hey, where's he going? I promised him he wouldn't take the chop unless I let him go and do a ceremonia. Where's the ceremonia? Lower East Side in Kaplan. So he gets on the F train and goes down. So he disappears. We're playing some French waltzes. At that time, French waltzes. Da 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 da. The lovely river Seine, or ba 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 ba. This guy comes running in, pushing people off the dance floor out of his way. He's in a coat. This trumpet player. He jumps up on the stage, cuts a measure in half, and starts going, Steht der Mädel und sie tracht. The whole band fell apart, didn't know what to do. And I looked at him and I said, what the hell are you doing? And he says, like Isaiah Hetman, see Isaiah? I am the older one. I should be respected. Not only was he a horrible trumpet player, he was a lousy singer too. So the whole band almost fell apart. What's the matter with my band? The leader is yelling out. Periton is yelling out, what's the matter with my band? Oy, oy, oy. I worked about 4 or 5 of these. And after those jobs, I across the street was a different hotel where some of my guys were working. I went over there, and I looked at Harry, the old accordion player, and he looked at me. We started to laugh uncontrollably. I started describing this music. It was like from an early talkie from either like Poland or something, or Lithuania, something like that. Never heard of a music like this in my life. And here I was like a hip, I was how did I end up in this place? He says, Kit, you're terrific. I give you all the chops. I said, fine. What can I say to him? I said, okay, fine. The only thing that I must say about him is that he paid me the full union scale and the other guy wouldn't. But all right. So I work with a bunch of people that were so horrible as not even to be described. But in those years, not like when the DJs took over. All of those guys were drummed out of the business very quickly. When the DJs took over, all of us got drummed out of the business. You can forget about the whole thing. Everything went underground. But that was the way it was. And these guys had jobs. They had lots of work. Mom and you. He said, I got a terrific bent. I got a violin and a wibes. The violin? A wibes, a vibraphone. Yeah. And the girl who played the wibes was one of his dear 2 daughters and a wife and him. It was the Periton family band. The girl who played the wibes put her foot down and has a sustain pedal on it. The first note was still ringing at the end of the job. The sound of this band was absolutely unbelievable. I wish I had a recording of it. I really do. It was absolutely frightening. And yet these people were booking work. Well, of course, you see, the refugees didn't know the difference. To them, it was fine. And also, he talked their Lashon. I used to play the violin, he said. I had a beautiful vibrato. Oh, man. But he was a nice little guy. But the thing is this, he shouldn't have been allowed anywhere near a musical instrument. Oy vey. Yeah. They had a hotel they used to play in the summer, and when the acts used to come over there, they used to have to prepare themselves. They used to have to drink themselves. Oh my God, I'm going to the Butler Lodge. What am I going to do? I got the Peritons. Ay. Yeah, there was there were. I started out in the really the bottom rung, and I worked my way up. I ended up working with good players of my own age, and I was just as happy to do that. Mm-hmm. Now, I was working with Dave in the early to mid 70s. He still had a couple of jobs left, and it was very nice because he put together some good bands, and it was always, you always had nice music when you had a guy like Dave. And of course, with the Epstein boys, I was the fifth Epstein brother. I used to sit in the bandstand and watch them fight. And well, as long as Maxie was, Maxie was, all of them were good. Julie was a good drummer. Julie played good Dixieland drums too. He used to take me on his Dixieland jobs. Mm-hmm. I was his good luck charm. Took me on society jobs. I went to work for Lester Lannon, and I worked for people like that. The funny thing is that the Klezmer thing came along in the late 70s.
How?
Henry Saposnik's father was the cantor in our local synagogue on Avenue S, the Marine Park Jewish Center. And I remember once we were there on a Rosh Hashanah, and I see this guy with a ponytail and a white suit. And I said, "Oh yeah, Unglück hat mir getroffen." Imagine that, these poor people. Look at that son they have over there, a hippie. Well, he was a kind of a hippie. Well, we managed to get together somehow, and he brought over some of his friends, some of these guys who were doing research, and they brought me some recordings and asked me to talk about them. And I played them some of the stuff that I had. By that point, I had a few of the Dave Terrace things. They played me all these Naftulas, and I picked up a bunch of recordings of that. So I started to learn some of the stuff that was before my time yet. And then Henry got the idea well, first he formed a band called Capella. And he wanted me to be the clarinet player in Capella. I said, no, at that time I was living here already. I was married. I said, no, I can't do that. I have children. I can't go. These guys were barnstorming. They were all single. I can't do that. And besides that, I didn't want to go back to being clarinet player anymore. I was playing keyboard. That was where I wanted to be. When he got the idea for Klez Camp, I was one of the first ones he ever told about it. 1983, he got this idea. Now, listen, we got to do this thing. I want to. So that sounds interesting. Well, when he formed the first Klez Camp, I brought him Sid Beckerman. And so I was the first clarinet teacher in Klez Camp, 1985. Netsky taught piano that year. I taught clarinet. So Sidney and I team taught. I would say, here's a way to do it. Sidney, show him. And Sidney would play his little thing, because Sidney was not much of a talker, but he could demonstrate. And he also did very well one-on-one. He would say, try this, try that, try the other thing over there. So a kid would come up and start playing a little thing, and Sidney would say, why don't you try doing it this way? It worked perfectly. Really went very well. So we became two of the big stars. I made Sidney into a big star. He says, now that I'm a big star, do I still have to take out the garbage? And for Sidney, that was a wonderful thing, because people always considered him to be like third rate. He was not, he didn't have the real, with Danny Rubenstein, who really played. That was Howie Lisa's cousin. And Howie and Paul Pincus was a real great classical clarinet player and really could play the music. Sidney played, but meanwhile, if you listen to Sidney a little bit and you hear that he doesn't sound just like the other guy, he sounds like himself. That was the thing that really went over. So I went to Sidney and I said, we took him on a job. Henry and I booked a job, and we took Sidney on the job. And Sidney ran away from me. I said, you're never going to do this to me again. I'm coming to your house tomorrow. So I went to his house with a little keyboard and a little battery-powered keyboard and a battery-powered amplifier and a little Sony Walkman recording machine. I said, okay, play. He played about 40 or 50 tunes. I took him home. As I was writing them down, I learned the correct harmonies for them. And by the time the next job came around, I knew everything that Sidney taught me. He was shocked. Couldn't believe it. Then he couldn't go anywhere without me because I was the only guy who could play his stuff. And so we went up over there.
So what was different about what he played?
The style was a little bit different. He didn't play with it wasn't quite as Yiddish a tom, but it still was very Jewish, of course. But the sound he had very, very little vibrato. It was kind of a round kind of a sound, not like when you hear a Dave or a Maxi, you could hear more vibrato coming out of the thing, where Sidney had very little. But you know something? By the time we made the Klezmer Plus album, I had Howie on the sax and Sidney on the clarinet and a good trumpet player. Sidney was not he couldn't go into a recording studio and read everything right off, but we were all playing stuff that he was so familiar with. And I said, okay, you'll play this one, you'll play this one, you'll play this one. I gave him a little list of things we're going to play here. I'll play a little bit, he plays a little bit, etc. That record came out great. And Sidney became, oh man, everybody started copying the stuff. We heard an Argentine group playing repertoire off that record. So what's this all about? Oh boy, I didn't know it, but people were copying my stuff. So, Klezkamp later on we brought some more, I brought up Paul Pincus, high quality clarinet player, Howie Leese I brought up there, so Sidney, Howie Leese, Sidney's him. I brought up Julie Epstein, the drummer, and we introduced them to some of the older generation of the music. Because, the Frank Londons were into a different kind of a thing.
Well, so you said, when Hank Sapoznik had this idea, you thought it was interesting. How did he pitch it? What did he say?
Well, he wanted to make a seminar out of the thing to teach young, aspiring Jewish musicians how to play the style. That caught me right away. And so we did it. And it became the place to be. Actually, when Klez Canada was founded, it was founded much, much later. And Klez Canada was a cheap copy of what we did.
You saw the things were changing, when by the time Klezkamp came around. What had changed in sort of in the way that you were playing out or in the Jewish music scene?
Well, a lot of young people were now in there, and they began to put pop effects in there. And, most of these were not familiar with the old ways at all. These were American kids. And what they would do would be to kind of, it seemed to me that much of what they were doing sounded like a caricature of the music. It didn't have the flavor of the real thing. But I learned, to my dismay, that people wanted a caricature. They didn't want the real flavor. The real flavor was too old-fashioned for them. They wanted something that had a kind of a, after all, if you listen to Frank London, it sounds like a mixture of like post-avant-garde jazz and rock and roll. It's only guys like me, we're the only ones left, and I'm one of the few that's left now at all, because almost all those guys I had up in Klezkamp are dead now. Sidney's gone, Paul, Howie Leese is gone, they're all gone. I'm one of the last ones left. And yet I still doggedly hold on to this thing because I like that sound. I like the real sound. See, what's his name? Andy Statman had it. But Andy got tired of playing the enough Tula tunes over and over again, and now he started to make up his own things. He's got this kind of chanting kind of thing that he does. So he doesn't do that anymore either. And most of the klezmer bands that play have been either students of Klez Canada or students of the other place, and they just, the problem is that the style is the weakest part of that music. It doesn't have the what I would consider to be the real. It doesn't have the correct swing to it. It doesn't have the melodic phrasing that the music requires. And well, of course, when you hear people speaking Yiddish, you can tell that yes and no, if you know what I mean.
So you taught, as you just said, you taught many of the people who are playing, Jewish music now.
Yeah.
Did you like teaching? What did you like about?
What did I like about it? Because it gave me an opportunity to show people what the real thing was about. I had good and bad. I had some pupils over there who really weren't really, into working at it. Sometimes I turned out some very good ones. I had one band, oh boy, that was around the late 80s or so. Boy, that thing sounded, I called a Longines Symphonette. Rather large group, and I had good players in there. I had one pianist. I showed him how to do a certain style of piano solo. Boy, this guy jumped on that thing like nobody's business. Once in a while, you really get some winners. So, but, the rest of the thing, most klezmer bands are quite amateurish. Well, it has to be, because the kind of people who are playing it are not professionals who, like guys like me. Well, the fact of the matter is that when we started teaching this music to other people, they took away our livelihood eventually. Some of our students became the next band leaders, and people took them. Also, some of them were women leaders. That was a hip thing to do at the time. And, we kind of look like a bunch of old guys. People don't want old guys. That's what happened.
Yeah. What do you think of this term that everyone uses, a klezmer revival?
Well, it's a revival. That's exactly what it was, because when it started, the klezmer revival is old. It started in 1978, 79, 80. That's 30 odd years ago. 35 years. Think about it. The klezmer music, what had happened was that during the war especially, the music that had been klezmer, they were old people. People who had come over in 1890s, 1900s, 19-teens or something like that. Those people were already old. They were beginning to die off. Their children liked Glenn Miller, Frank Sinatra, whatever it was. Jewish music was tertiary or even quadruple someplace, it was going down in people's. So by the time that I came into the business, nobody wanted to hear it anymore. It was just about gone. So when this Israeli stuff came in, it was much simpler. Here's Sammy Musiker. Sammy Musiker was Dave Terrace's son-in-law. His daughter married Sammy. Sammy was a giant of a clarinet player. He was a featured clarinet soloist on a very good swing band, Gene Krupa. And boy, could Sammy play. Well, Sammy invented a form of klezmer that he thought was going to catch the people's ear. He's going to take the best qualities of klezmer and swing and put them together in a new klezmer style. And so he wrote all kinds of stuff that went from one key to the other and all over the place over there. It sounded like more like advanced swing already. People listen, what the hell is he doing? What is it? And then along came Hava Nagila Hava. Goodbye, Sammy. Sammy was in the army. He was drafted into the army. He was there for 5 years, from 41 to 46. He comes out of the army. Number one, the clarinet's no longer popular. Everything is sax. Although Sammy played good sax. But there were so many saxophone players, you know. Sammy had a clarinet head. But, you know, the few clarinet players that were left, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, the modern guy, Buddy DeFranco, you know, the clarinet was not hip anymore. So Sammy comes out of the Army. What's he have to do now? He's married to Dave Terrace's daughter. While he was in the Army, they got married. So Sammy had been working for Dave Terrace. Dave is the king and Sammy's the crown prince. Do you think the king, who's still living and still at the height of his powers, is going to give the crown prince? Go away from here. So Sammy wanted to get away from Dave. He wanted to be a musical personality, and he thought with this klezmer swing, that would do it. But it was too complex. What he did was he overestimated the intelligence of his audience. The audience are a bunch of dummies. After all, the audience would buy Al Perriton. The audience would buy Ralph Kahn. That's what they were buying. And people loved it. Ralph Kahn booked a lot of jobs. Because they didn't know the difference. They didn't know what they were listening to. And so what happened was that the Israeli tunes came in and all you needed were 3 or 4 of them to play on a job, and that was all. And okay, you'd play a little bit of the popular Shaved Lavona kind of stuff and Buy Me a Mr. Shane. Maybe 2 or 3 songs. So there was very, very little to play. Poor Sammy had to go back to club dates again. Instead of becoming a jazz recording star, a radio star, or something like that, like he was thinking of doing, like it was when he was with a group. Oh man, Sammy Music, you know. Nope, didn't happen. So what happened was that the klezmer music went. Also, people thought of klezmer as being the music of the destroyed race. After all, European Jewry was practically destroyed. And the klezmer was a reminder of that. Israel was the new, hopeful, upcoming Hatikva. This is the coming place to hope. And their new music was a music simplified that brought new hope to people. Listen to this. Atza alinu, atza alinu, atza alinu, which is not babi da 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 da. Nah, that sounds too old-fashioned. That's grandma's music. Now atza alinu, that's for us. That's it. That's the new modern. Well, then the Hasidic stuff came around. See, the Hasidim don't want to know from the Israelis because they consider the Israelis to be total goyim. So they had their own, which is right in the middle of the klezmer and the Israeli. It's much simpler than the. Well, what happens was that all these musicians like Dave and like Naftullah, who were really virtuosi on their instruments, were making up these songs that challenged them. But the audience didn't know from nothing. But the Hasidic stuff is, some Rebbe made up a tune. I die, da 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 da, I die, da 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 da. Very simple. That's it. I we used to sing Old Man River, that Old Man River. That's what we call that thing. And after a while, see, the Hasidic music now you wouldn't recognize anymore. It's rock and roll. It's 100% rock and roll. That guy came over from Israel called Piamenta, Yossi Piamenta, who I played with many times. He introduced, first of all, seismic volume, and second of all, real rock. We want Mashiach now. We want Mashiach now. So all of a sudden, all the bands, instead of playing clarinet, now you played saxophone. You had a honking style. So today's Israeli, today's Hasidic dance music is not really Hasidic anymore. It's rock and roll.
So how does the klezmer revival fit into that?
It doesn't. In other words, the people who are doing the klezmer revival are non-religious people. They don't know about the Hasidic music. They don't want to know about the Hasidic music. they want it to sound still a little bit Jewish, so they add some rock effects to it. Whereas the Hasidic music at present is all rock and roll. Every band has to have a guitar player. They never had no guitar players when I first went in the business. The band used to be 2 trumpets, two reeds, so they could switch off on a clarinet, 1 keyboard, and a drummer. That was the band. And not anymore. Now they have electric bass. We want Mashiach now.
When you look at the klezmer scene now, who do you respect?
That's a difficult question for you to ask me. I was there when it was born. The best young clarinet player in the line is Michael Winograd, without a question. As a matter of fact, I'm in a band with him. He also is able to go from place to place to place and say something. He's got a trumpet player named Ben Holmes, who is absolutely superb. This guy plays such beautiful. He sounds like my friend Marty Bass. It's a delight to listen to this boy. We have a band called the Tara's Band. We play Tara's repertoire. That's a nice band. It's a nice band, Kenai and Hara. Yes, I think that... see, Frank London is very creative. He has a lot of ideas. Sometimes I think he overdoes it. But then again, he has a big audience, and he also knows how to sell. Boy, does this guy know how to sell. So his Klezmatics are one of the best selling bands in the so-called Klezmer line. But much of it is quite pop-oriented. But he knows a heck of a lot. See, Netsky had a situation where he put together a bunch of guys who were playing. His ideal was the Abe Schwartz recordings from the 20s. And he made a band sound like that. I don't know how busy they are anymore. Not very, I don't think. See, guys like me, I'm practically retired. They don't want me anymore.
What has it been like to you, for you to sort of mentor these young artists that are now, you know, the main representatives of Klezmer Jewish music?
Put it this way. They come to me, they ask me questions, I answer them. I give it right off the top like I do here. Same deal. They can take it or leave it. I basically think, and I give them my opinions. Sometimes my opinions are too old-fashioned for them. But I think I have something to say. I feel that there should be a place where authenticity should be one of the characteristics of the music. I am not interested in, turning it into a different kind of a thing than it really is. Mm-hmm. You notice one thing. Bluegrass people play bluegrass. They don't put rock and roll in there. And if they can do it, why can't we? Why does it have to sound like rock? Why does it have to sound like country and western? Why is our music, people say, it's too old. It's not my way of thinking. Well, I also play Dixieland music, and that's plenty old.
So why do you think people do have that reaction to?
Why do they have that reaction? Audiences. I'm going to be teaching a class this year at Klez Camp called Meine Liebe Zuhörer, or my dear audience. What is the audience? What do they want to hear in the way of music? They like trends. They like trends. That's what they're interested in. And the new trend is to have it sound like this or that or the other thing. My dear friend Josh Dolgan, who I love, he's a great, funny guy, very, very bright. He takes all this hip-hop stuff and he's got it all. You can get the hip-hop stuff any place. What makes it Jewish? Nothing. It's hip-hop. Okay? And I get into arguments with him. That's my own fault. I should just say, do what you want, go away from me. And that's basically what I've learned to do. The problem with the audience is that they know very little and don't want to be educated. Okay? So if you have a gimmicky sound that will produce, a titillation that will give the audience the kind of a feeling that, yeah, okay, hey, what about, isn't that fun? Oh boy. But there is an art to this. Maxie was art. Dave was art. Naftullah in his own way was art. Shloimke, Sidney was art. I played with all these great people. The style was, bands were solid, they were good. But for some reason or other, it doesn't behoove people anymore to be authentic. Certainly I feel that way about the as I said, if bluegrass can be played authentically and have a huge audience, people come and listen to it from everywhere. What's the matter with the klezmer? For some reason or other, it's not hip to be authentically Jewish. But not among the Orthodox don't want to know from it. All they want is this rock and roll. Well, I can't force feed them. That's all. So I fade it into the background and I play with my babies.
Do you see any points of interaction between the Orthodox world and the klezmer scene?
No. The Orthodox world is essentially based upon using music for their parties. And also, it's got to have a God reference. If it doesn't have a God reference, they don't want to know from it. Klezmer music is essentially instrumental music that may at one time have been God-centered. But it isn't. Most of the music that the Orthodox people like are these singers. Shweki, Lipa Schmelzer, this one, that one. Oh, Lipa Schmelzer's just a hip-hop artist. The one I call the Michael Jackson of Jewish music, Avram Fried, who happens to be a friend of mine. I like him. He's a nice guy. He was in the choirs of Lubavitch when I was the house conductor there 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And Mordechai Ben David, okay. They are selling rock pop. So what it has done is that it has cleared the performance area of any real authenticity that the music once had.
How we were talking about how the klezmer scene,
the relationship between the Orthodox and the klezmer.
Yeah.
There are a very, very few people, mainly Israeli types, who are really basically very Hasidic type, who like the clarinet sound. There's a guy called Kletskin, I believe he plays very well. And there's another fellow over there, I forget what his name is. And what they're doing is playing old klezmer tunes like old klezmer. And they're doing an authentic job of it. But certainly in this country, the music that pervades that scene is pop music, with pop style. It has been that way for the last 25, 30 years.
So if you want to look, what makes authentic Jewish music, in your opinion?
It has to be, first of all, it was performed by people who grew up in a totally Jewish milieu. And it had a quality of the music itself that was a folk type music. Essentially klezmer music is dance music. I was shocked when all of a sudden I see people sitting in audiences listening to dance music. We used to play it was dance music, It has to have a quality of the sound that you can hear it immediately. Say, there it is, real Jewish music. It has to be Jewish. If it's full of rock and roll and full of all that kind of stuff and full of, Lester Bowie licks and things like that, it's not It's not really, it's just bastardized, frankly. And what can I tell you? I'm guilty of it sometimes too. I throw in Fats Waller piano on some of my klezmer things, because that happens to be a specialty of mine. But there's nobody else who can do it because nobody else can. But it's a tough situation. When I was playing with Max, it was always because Max was totally true to the form. I just went with him, man. I just laid right behind him. We just gave him that rhythm that he needed to play his stuff. Mm. And more than that, I can't say. It is a style. It had a style of its own. It was its own thing. It was a mixture of nothing else. It was Jewish. Yeah, there was a certain amount, maybe you'd get a little Hungarian quality because a lot of those people played around the gypsies. So a certain amount of gypsy music did sink in there. Certain Polish, Russian, even Middle Eastern, Turkish and things like that. Well, that kind of stuff was endemic, Naftuli used to have a nice. He had a feeling that he liked Turkish and Greek effects in the music that he played. But he phrased it like, Northern European Jewish music. It had a Jewish quality. It sounded like chazunas. It sounded like a cantor singing. If it loses that cantorial feel, it's gone. That's what's required, okay?
Yeah. Do you consider yourself an activist for this?
Not anymore, I ain't. No. In other words, I have always been a guy who's involved in the business of making music. People call me, I go and I play it. This coming Sunday, I'm going out to the White Plains Library with a nice little klezmer trio. And it's Ken Maltz and myself and Marty Confurious, the bass player, and we call ourselves the Legends of Klezmer because we are. At this point, we're playing authentic klezmer. And activist? Was meint das? Activist. Weiß ich nicht. In other words, when I get up and perform, I'm an activist. Do I want to go running around and calling up people and knocking on doors and things like that? That's a businessman. Frank does that, not me.
What's the relationship with Yiddish language in your lifetime, in your career?
Well, a certain amount of it I'm performing in Yiddish sometimes. I certainly can speak. I've known a lot of these Yiddishists and things like that, and I can talk to them in Yiddish. I did. I have. I do. It's a part of the thing, It's part of the culture.
What role do you see yourself as a performing artist playing in transmitting Yiddish culture?
Just do my thing, and it's there. That's it. I just do my thing, and there it is. I do it as authentically as I can, and some people like what I do.
What do you see as the future of Jewish music?
Future of Jewish music is going to be more and more of the amalgam with the pop thing. I have always said that when rock and roll comes in contact with any other form of music, rock and roll eats up the other music. Rock and roll is the dominant force in music and has been for 50 years now. I can't believe it myself. It's 50 years. I mean, the swing music only lasted for about 15 years. That's all. And boy, was that good. You had guys like Roy Eldridge and Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young, man, with great players and all that kind of stuff. Well, after a while, people just, in the still, or Nothing But a Hound Dog, or Hold My, I Want to Hold Your Hand, or whatever else, or whatever other pop things are going on. The young kids just love it. They look at me like I'm some kind of a dinosaur. That's when I say to people I'm playing over here, listening to music for dinosaurs. Here I am, the original dinosaur. That's fine. I buy it.
You own that identity.
I made it up for myself. I have it. There it is.
Yeah.
Because I am an old-time music performer. I like old-time music. I prefer it to performing more other kinds of things, even though I can. Played lots of rock and roll in my time, played lots of Latin in my time, played all of these things. I played in Irish bands.
Has there been a particularly, I mean, we talked about the disasters. Has there been a meaningful performance for you?
What do you mean by that?
Like a particular gig that you played that was emotionally meaningful for you?
Not really. I'm a pro. I go on the job and I do it. If the audience connects, that's the only emotional thing that I have with it.
Yeah. How often do you speak Yiddish now?
Wenn ich muss, rede ich. Wenn ich rede mit Leuten, wir reden Jiddisch. Ich habe eine Sache, was ich tue. Jeden Mal, wenn ich spiele für eine Gruppe von altitschke Volk. Ich sagte sehr so. Wie viele Menschen du verstehen Jiddisch? They look at me. Wie viele Menschen du verstehen gar nicht kein Jiddisch? People raise their hands and say, ah! And so, okay, I have to translate for them. And very often I do. I tell them, tell me alter, tell me geschwind, hey, tell me, old fella, tell me right away. I want to know everything right now. You know, so I do it line by line sometimes.
Yeah.
A lot of these people say, ich verstehe ein bisschen. I understand a lot more Yiddish than a lot of people do. But as a matter of course, I don't really talk it like frequently with people. Mm-hmm. When I do, I can.
I just have one more question, but is there anything else, any other topics we didn't get to? You really anything you want to say?
I don't think so, not really. In other words, my two basic things are classic jazz and this. And sometimes I mix them up a little bit, sometimes I don't. All depends on who I'm working with, all depends on what the situation is. A lot of the people that I work for are essentially Americanized people, and they want to hear some of each. In other words, I go into American composers of Jewish derivation, like Gershwin, Berlin, Kern, etc. So I do some of their material, and I tell the stories about Sholem Secunda and all that stuff, and you know, so. Not really, because as I say, I'm a pro. I go up there and I entertain for the people. I have standard shtick that I do all the time, and it works, because most of the people I work for are older people. Most of them range in age from late 70s to nearly 90. So fine, I do it.
Actually, I lied. I have a couple more questions. How did you meet your wife?
How did I meet my wife? How did I meet my wife? Hey? You really want to know?
Yeah.
We were in college together. Brooklyn College, my alta schmatte. Believe me, what a schmatte that is now. Oy vey. We met in the music department over there. We were doing Gilbert and Sullivan type shows, and what's his name? Offenbach and people like that she used to do. She's a trained singer, classical singer. She sings in choirs now, Jewish choirs. And she has quite an exceptional sensitivity and knowledge of her main thing when she was young was Israeli stuff. That was what she really liked. She really didn't have much of a feel for Yiddish. But she picked up Yiddish coming to Klez camp, people like that. She had contact with people like Adrian Cooper, who taught her some of the things about repertoire and whatever it was. And she picked up a bunch of these things. As a matter of fact, in one of our, things for one of our memorials to Adrian, I had her do Vilna, which was one of the songs that I learned from Adrian. And she did a superb Vilna, really. It's delightful. It was really like an excellent piece. And so we met, I was like 20, and she was about a year and a half younger, 18 and a half, 19. We were, you know, she was a little bit, she ended up majoring in English, I ended up majoring in music. And we married in 1962. We're married 51 years, get out her. And we have 2 sons and 6 grandchildren, which is not a bad deal. And she's very sensitive to music. She likes what I do. I like what she does. And it's been very successful on that count.
And what kind of Jewish home did you create in your...
There is the person who's responsible. She is the one who is responsible. Her mother came from a family in which her grandfather, was like a roof. He's a very, very religious man. Now, he had 9 surviving children. They had some, I don't have to tell you about what went on there. And in that case, only 3 of them maintained any kind of Yiddishkeit at all. My mother-in-law was one of them. My father-in-law really came from a situation like my father, non-religious people. He was also born here to people from the other side. And funny thing is, he ended up a chemistry teacher. My father ended up, he taught piano when he was a kid. So my father ended up teaching piano because he couldn't become a chemical engineer. My father was a chemistry teacher at my high school, Brooklyn Tech. My mother was a librarian at her high school, James Madison. And so obviously it was beshert. And when we were married about a year or 2 or whatever, all of a sudden the lights didn't go on anymore. On Shabbos, and then I turned off the light in the refrigerator. I didn't know what to do because I didn't want that. That was not what I was looking for at all. But the boys were brought up and they went to yeshivas. And they today study, learn. Both of my sons are brilliant as far as Hebrew learning. And my older one, Michael, can daven from the Omid like nobody's business. He's just superb. But he can lane, one of the best Bali Koira that I've ever heard. When the grandchildren began to come into the picture, all of a sudden I began to see things a little differently. She became totally Shabbat Shabbos when her mother died in 1975. Then she began to put on sheitel. She wears sheitel. And everything that had to be done, she did. And she brought the boys idolize her. They took her way of life. Me, while I was going out on Saturdays playing jobs and all that kind of stuff, no. She and the boys went to shul. Well, when this little one, this grandson came into the picture, I began to think about it. I said, what do I need this for? I was already getting older. I had my first grandchild, I was 53. I'm now 73. It became easier for me to realize that living an Orthodox life is not as limiting as I thought it might be, because besides that, my music is going the way of all flesh, So I became this house of Shabbos. Shabbos comes around. That's why I didn't want you people to come to me tomorrow. It's just not possible. I won't have it. And go to shul every week, the whole works, everything. I don't do all the things that I should do, but I'm, a heck of a lot closer than I used to be. But she is totally and completely observant. And anybody has any questions, ask her. She knows. She basically knows many of the answers. One of her brothers became strictly Orthodox. My sister married an Orthodox man. So 2 of my mother's, the Red Communists, 2 of her kids married from. So my sister is in Eretz Yisrael now. Well, so we have Orthodoxy in the family. And my sympathies are basically with the Orthodox approach. I think it's a good approach. The children, I have, her middle brother has about 40 grandchildren, along with mine, and these are diamonds. Each child is precious. They're so good. They're so nice. They're so sweet. They're real children. They're not like young rock and rollers. Well, there's something to be said for that. They're children. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the way to do it. That's the way to bring them up. There's a kind of a zizkeit. There's a sweetness about it. that the others just don't have. They're all so, in your face. None of my grandnephews, grandnieces, none of my grandchildren are like that. They're not in your face. They don't behave like that. It isn't done. They're good. They're children. It's nice to have children, and they're growing up, and they're growing up to have values. As far as I'm concerned, that's the way to go. I don't need to go to places where everything is treif. That's Jewish. Not really.
So, do you have an Eitze?
Wus Eitze? Eitze für wus?
Eitze?
Wie zu spielen? Wie zu reden? Was zu machen?
Was soll ein junger Musikant machen?
Ein junger Musikant soll machen ein paar Sachen. Die erste Sache ist, zu spielen das Instrument geht. Hört sich rein zu Leid, wir spielen artistisch. Scheine Sache für was zu hören, zu lernen. Und die zweite Sache ist, es soll sein Jiddisch. Zu Jiddisch und Tam. Wir können lernen, wie zu tun. Kommt zu mir. Ich zeige euch. Das ist einfach.
Nu, hartstikke Dank. And thank you very much from me and also from the Yiddish Book Center.